I remember the moment I realized I wasn't sitting beside her. The chair, meant for me at her wedding, stood empty. The soft hum of conversation around the reception, the clinking of glasses, and the distant laughter of relatives sharpened the sting. I froze, gripping the edge of my jacket as the wedding coordinator approached quietly, lowering her voice so only I could hear. She told me my place was at a table across the room. Across the room, not beside my daughter, the one I had held in my arms, sewn her first dresses by hand, whispered bedtime stories to while the world slept. Across the room, separated not by a few feet, but by the weight of a lifetime of unacknowledged devotion. My heart thumped in disbelief. I tried to move forward, to mask my shock, but each step felt heavier than the last. There she sat, radiant in her gown, a dress I had stitched with aching fingers under the glow of a lamp that never warmed the chill I now felt. Every stitch, every seam, a labor of love, of pride, of hope, that she would remember who had held her close, who had fought to make this day possible. Yet she didn't glance at me, not once. She smiled at the guests, laughed at their jokes, nodded at the speeches, and left me suspended in a limbo of my own creation, where my role as her father had been erased. I wanted to call out to her, to remind her that I was here, that every decision I had made had been with her best interests at heart. But the words stuck in my throat. In their place, a quiet horror spread through me, a realization that this wasn't just a moment of oversight. This was orchestrated. Someone had planted seeds of influence, nudging her away from the man who had built her world from scratch, the man who had given her more than she would ever know. Was it her fiancé, a friend, or an ill-meaning relative? I couldn't say. All I knew was the truth of my own hands, calloused from decades of labor, sewing, repairing, building, loving, and protecting. I sank into my chair at the distant table, watching her movements, her laughter, the ease with which she mingled. My chest tightened. The betrayal cut not with words, but with absence. She had taken my place, my seat, my moment, and left me invisible. In that instant, I understood a pain I had only feared, that even the purest acts of love can go unnoticed, manipulated by others, or reframed in ways that wound the giver more deeply than any external insult. The memories surfaced unbidden, guiding her through her first dance, measuring her shoulders for the dress, the nights I had stayed up adjusting hems and adding delicate embroidery to make her day perfect. And now, none of it mattered. The dress, so carefully crafted, so full of intention and tenderness, was worn by a daughter who didn't see the hands that labored for her happiness. My heart ached with disbelief and sorrow, a mixture of love and mourning that no words could bridge. In that crowded hall, I realized that the true wound wasn't the distance across the room, but the distance in her mind. She didn't just ignore me physically. She had rewritten the narrative of our lives. The man who had given everything, quietly, steadily, and without fanfare, had become a shadow. And I wondered, in the quiet between the music and the applause, how one builds a bridge back to a child whose vision of reality has been shaped by others. I sat, unmoored, feeling the depth of loss sharpen with every passing minute. Yet beneath the grief, a sliver of clarity emerged. I knew who I was, what I had done, and what love had driven me to do. The betrayal stung, but it did not erase my history, my intentions, or the painstaking care I had invested in her life. My hands had worked, my heart had given, and my soul had loved. And in that recognition, I found a quiet strength amid the humiliation. What would you feel if your own child erased you on the most important day of her life? I asked myself, not expecting an answer, but knowing the question carried the weight of every stitch I had ever sewn, every silent sacrifice, and every moment that had led to this painful public absence. The room continued its celebrations, unaware of the invisible wound, unaware that a father, once central to his child's joy, now sat alone, carrying the gravity of a love unacknowledged, a labor unseen, and a betrayal that would linger long after the music faded. I remember the nights I spent under the lamplight, fingers stiff and eyes aching from hours of careful stitching. The wedding dress lay across the old oak table, a sea of fabric that demanded precision and patience I wasn't sure I could give. Every seam, every delicate pleat was a decision made in love, a choice to save her money and spare her the stress of expensive alterations. I traced the patterns with my calloused hands, whispering to myself that each stitch was a promise, that I would always be there, quietly supporting her, even when the world seemed indifferent. The work was exhausting. My back ached from hunching over the table, the thread slipping through my fingers more than once, the needle pricking my skin. Yet each pain was a reminder of her future happiness, of the smile I imagined on her face when she first saw the completed dress. She had no idea, of course, of the sacrifices it took. She only saw the dress, the end result, and assumed it appeared effortlessly. My labor, my late nights, my silent worry over each measurement, were invisible threads woven into the very fabric she would wear down the aisle. I remember her early excitement vividly. During the initial fittings, her eyes sparkled as she twirled, imagining the wedding day. She asked questions about the lace, the hem, the way the bodice would sit, full of energy and delight. I answered carefully, hiding my exhaustion, hiding the little aches and the fatigue that weighed on me. I wanted her to feel the joy without the burden of knowing the cost. I wanted her to see only the magic, not the hours I'd spent shaping it by hand. But even then, I sensed small cracks forming. She would glance at her phone mid-conversation, her mind elsewhere, or ask about other things without fully appreciating the care in the dress's details. Small moments, almost imperceptible, yet enough to plant seeds of misunderstanding. I brushed them aside, hoping they were fleeting distractions rather than hints of growing distance. I reminded myself that adolescence and young adulthood carried distraction, that her mind was full of its own concerns, and that my role was to be patient, to keep giving without expectation. Now, at the wedding, those small cracks had become a canyon. She stood in the dress I had sewn, radiant, poised, but distant. The excitement I had known, the shared anticipation during fittings and late-night discussions, had vanished. She avoided my gaze, smiled at others, but not at me. The hands that had labored over every hem, every stitch, every subtle fold were ignored. The love woven into the seams seemed to evaporate in the coldness of her distance. I reflected on the sacrifices I had made beyond the dress itself. The time I gave up, the evenings alone while others rested, the worry I carried silently, all for her day to be perfect. Every pricked finger, every strained eye, every moment of tension while aligning the lace had been for her. Yet the acknowledgement, the simple warmth of gratitude, was absent. The labor that had been my offering of love was now a ghost, unrecognized, overshadowed by the wedge of separation. And I realized, with a sorrow that gnawed quietly, that this was more than mere oversight. The misunderstanding had deep roots. My dedication had been misperceived, my care mistaken for something less than it was. In trying to give without complaint, I had left space for misinterpretation. And now, standing in the shadows of the celebration, I felt the weight of both love and heartbreak entwined. The dress remained perfect in its elegance, but the moment was hollow. My daughter, whom I had imagined seeing light up with recognition, now passed me by, absorbed in a day that should have been shared. My hands had shaped her dreams into fabric, yet she saw only the final image, unaware of the devotion embedded in every fold. I sat, feeling the ache in my chest match the ache in my hands, knowing that labor alone could not bridge the growing distance. My love was stitched invisibly into the dress, into the life I had tried to support, and yet it remained unseen, unacknowledged, and unreturned. I noticed the shift before anyone else did, though I didn't know its depth at the time. The calls I once anticipated with warmth now went unanswered, my messages left hanging, my presence seemingly unwanted. Visits I planned carefully, wanting to share simple moments and stories, were met with excuses or silence. Each ignored attempt pressed into me a quiet, gnawing fear that something had changed irrevocably. It wasn't abrupt, it was a slow fade, subtle as a shadow stretching over familiar walls. I recalled small moments from her childhood, moments I had thought were insignificant. A rolling of the eyes when I suggested a simple rule, a quick sigh when I offered advice, a hesitation to hug before school. At the time, I chalked them up to adolescent moods, to the natural independence every child seeks. Yet now, looking back, I understood that these were the first threads of misunderstanding, threads that had woven into a tapestry of resentment she carried unknowingly. The first real confrontation crystallized my worry. She spoke sharply, accusing me of trying to control her life, of suffocating her. with my intentions. The words cut deep, for in my mind, I had always acted out of love and concern, guiding without overstepping, protecting without claiming ownership of her choices. But perception, I realized, can be more powerful than truth. Her mind had built a narrative of oppression from gestures meant as care. The helplessness of seeing a child misunderstand the very intentions that had nurtured her stirred both sorrow and confusion in me. I questioned myself constantly. Had I been too insistent, too present, too firm in ways she resented? Guilt gnawed at me in quiet moments, whispering that perhaps I had contributed to this widening gap. And yet, the truth lingered stubbornly. My actions had been protective, born from love, not manipulation. The struggle between guilt and moral clarity became a private torment, one I carried in the quiet spaces between attempted calls and visits. Hints of outside influence became increasingly clear. A friend, a partner, or someone she trusted seemed to have colored her perspective, planting seeds of doubt where none should have grown. I could sense the subtle changes in her demeanor, the hesitations, the defensiveness that had not been there before. Each encounter carried an unspoken weight, a barrier between us that had been erected invisibly. The realization that someone else might have shaped her attitude added layers of worry and moral outrage I could not easily shake. Every gesture I offered, once met with warmth, now seemed filtered through suspicion. My attempts to connect were misread as pressure, my advice as control. The distance grew silently, unnoticed by the world, but palpable to me in every interaction, every missed greeting, every glance she withheld. Helplessness settled over me like a shadow, heavy and unrelenting, as I understood that the love I gave freely was being obscured by misperception and influence beyond my reach. I reflected on the years we had shared, the care and guidance provided, the countless small acts that had shaped her life. Each memory carried both pride and sorrow, for the same hands that had supported her were now unseen, their impact questioned, their purpose misinterpreted. The estrangement, slow and almost invisible, revealed the fragility of understanding, even between those bound by blood and years of devotion. I sat quietly in the spaces she no longer filled, feeling the pressure of silence as a moral weight. I could not reach her with arguments, nor could I force her to recognize the truth behind my intention. The realization that a child could distance herself so completely, influenced by both past misinterpretations and present guidance from others, left me with a persistent ache, one that neither time nor explanation could easily soothe. I remember the day of the wedding, the sunlight catching the folds of her dress I had sewn with my own hands. Amid the flurry of final preparations, I noticed her face tight with tension, her smiles forced, her movements precise yet anxious. I assumed nerves, but deep down, a knot of unease had begun to form in my chest, one I could not yet name. Weeks later, a call from the florist who had arranged her flowers startled me. She asked if we could meet briefly, mentioning something she'd seen and felt at the event. Hesitant but compelled, I agreed. Sitting across from someone who had only observed from the periphery, I felt an odd mixture of anticipation and dread. Their calm, measured voice carried the weight of information I had long suspected but could not confirm. The florist spoke carefully, recounting how my daughter had seemed burdened by invisible pressures. She described her secrecy, the tight-lipped conversations with staff, and the careful avoidance of any situation that might cause a scene. She had overheard my daughter remark to a coordinator that she didn't want drama with her fiancé, a line I would replay in my mind countless times. The weight behind those words was unmistakable, a struggle to appear composed while wrestling with internal strain. As the florist continued, she detailed how my daughter had engaged in quiet negotiations of expectation and self-restraint, juggling the weight of family, personal desires, and the scrutiny of guests. Even in her moments of laughter and politeness, tension was visible. Small gestures of anxiety, fingers fidgeting with napkins, her gaze flicking toward me before quickly darting away. She had carried an unseen burden that day, one that I could only guess at, but had never fully understood until now. Hearing it from someone who had watched without bias brought both validation and heartbreak. Validation, because my unease had not been imagined. Heartbreak, because the knowledge of her struggle deepened the weight of our estrangement. The The realization that her public coldness had coexisted with private turmoil added layers to my grief. It was not indifference that had kept her distant, but pressure and anxiety that had been invisible to me until now. The florist's recounting painted a picture of my daughter under siege by expectations, both self-imposed and externally influenced. She had felt the need to manage every perception, every glance, every interaction, trying to shield her fiancé, her guests, and herself from any conflict. In doing so, she had unknowingly pushed me to the margin, the very person who had supported and nurtured her through every stitch, every decision, every small sacrifice of her youth. Listening, I realized the depth of what I had never seen, the isolation she had carried, even in the midst of celebration, the private turmoil masked by composure, the anxiety that had driven her to distance herself from me. It was a sorrow that cut deep, a mixture of grief for her unseen struggles and heartbreak over the rift that had widened between us. Yet within that grief, there was a subtle reassurance. I was not mistaken in my perception of the strain. My intuition about the unseen pressures she bore had been right all along. A stranger had seen what I could not, and in that acknowledgement, there was a strange, quiet relief. The florist's observations gave voice to my suspicions, giving weight to the invisible truths that had hovered between us for too long. I left the meeting with a heavy heart, carrying the knowledge that my daughter's coldness was not a simple rejection, but the manifestation of hidden pressures and expectations. It reshaped my understanding of her behavior, offering both painful insight and a confirmation of the silent struggles that had long been evident only in fleeting moments. I realized that empathy, though it did not bridge the gap, could illuminate the reasons behind it and prepare me for the difficult path ahead. I approached the floral shop that had been quietly observing the tension all morning, the scent of roses heavy in the air. The florist, someone I had only exchanged polite nods with before, motioned me into a back room, her eyes somber. She didn't need to speak long. The look on her face confirmed the unease I had sensed from the moment I arrived at the venue. She began with the wedding morning, describing my daughter's meticulous preparations. She smiled, the florist said, but it wasn't the same joy you remember from your planning days. There was a weight, as if she were holding herself back. My heart tightened. I had expected nerves, of course, but this was different, an invisible strain I had not foreseen. Then came the revelations that cut the deepest. The florist had overheard whispered conversations with her fiancé and a close friend, words that painted me as overbearing, controlling, someone who had dictated her life long after she was capable of making decisions herself. They spoke of limits I had never imposed, of freedom I had tried to preserve. Every word felt like a sharp blade, shaping the narrative she would carry into the ceremony. I thought of every sleepless night, every choice made in quiet sacrifice, the time I spent hand-sewing her wedding dress, the finances I adjusted to ensure the house remained secure, the emotional labor of supporting her through years of schooling and first apartments. None of it had been spoken about, none of it acknowledged. And now, in their absence, these stories had filled the gaps, twisting into a picture far from reality. The florist paused, glancing at me with the weight of what she had witnessed. She felt torn, she said softly, caught between loyalty to her new life, the shame of realizing how much she leaned on you, and the fear of seeming ungrateful to those she trusts now. I could hear the resonance in her words, the ache of a parent's love misunderstood, the pressure of false narratives steering a child away. I wanted to defend myself, to show her the reality behind each decision, each sacrifice. But even as the impulse rose, I knew it could shatter her further. Protecting her from this truth, preserving her sense of self, had to compete with the anger, the deep injustice I felt. My mind spun with memories and calculations, wondering how she could carry bitterness born from what she never fully saw, misled by those she thought understood her better than I ever could. And yet, the truth remained. Every late-night stitch, every financial adjustment, every word of advice given in love, it was all filtered through a lens of suspicion and misinterpretation. My daughter, who I had nurtured with unwavering devotion, had absorbed only fragments of reality, molded by outside influences that painted me as someone I was not. Leaving the florist's shop, I felt the weight of the divide between us. The layers of misinformation, the quiet manipulations, had shaped her resentment, Yet I could do nothing now but navigate the delicate balance of revealing the truth without harming her further. Each step I had taken, every sacrifice made, was a silent testament to my care. But silent care could be misread, misrepresented, and turned into a source of bitterness. I walked back through the city streets, a mix of anger, sorrow, and cautious understanding swirling in my chest. How fragile trust could become when truth is shadowed by misinterpretation. How vulnerable a child is when those they lean on for guidance are recast as villains in stories not their own. My love had been unwavering, my intentions clear to me. But clarity does not always travel across the distance between perception and reality. By the time I returned to the quiet of my home, I understood something essential. I could not erase the influence of false narratives, but I could hold steady, preserving dignity and truth in the spaces she could not yet see. And in that steadfastness, perhaps, lay the first step toward eventual reconciliation, however distant it might be. I asked for a quiet moment with her after the whirlwind of the wedding had settled, hoping for a conversation that could bridge the chasm between us. I pictured a calm room, a soft chair where we could speak openly, and the possibility, however fragile, of understanding. My heart carried both hope and trepidation as I approached her. I began gently, recounting the years of silent support, the careful planning, and the sacrifices that had always gone unseen. Every word felt weighted, a mixture of explanation and plea. I spoke of the dress I had stitched, of the late nights spent ensuring the house was secure, of the financial help she had unknowingly relied upon for years. I tried to frame it not as proof, but as context, a truth I hoped she could finally grasp. Her eyes hardened almost immediately. She shook her head, cutting me off with sharpness I had not anticipated. Each fact I offered was met with defensiveness, her voice trembling between frustration and hurt. It was clear that the narrative she had been given, the version of me as the controlling, self-serving parent, had rooted itself firmly in her mind. She repeated claims as if they were indisputable truths, echoing the words of those who had shaped her perceptions long before the wedding day. I felt a pang of validation. Yes, I had been careful, deliberate in my support, but it was overshadowed by the deep disappointment of her rejection. Here was my daughter, carrying misbeliefs that contradicted everything I had done, refusing to see the truth even when I presented it gently, calmly, with care. The room felt heavy, thick with unspoken tension, as each statement she made reinforced the divide. For a moment I struggled with frustration, a desire to correct every misconception, to insist that she see the reality of my intentions. But I quickly realized that pushing harder would not bring clarity, it would only drive her further away. The love I had carried for decades could not force understanding, it could only preserve dignity, even in the face of denial. I began to sense the limits of reconciliation. My words, carefully measured, were not enough to shift the beliefs cemented by external influence and long-standing misunderstandings. I understood, painfully, that attempting to dismantle her misconceptions in that moment could cause more harm than good. My priority had to shift from explanation to protection, protecting both her emotional state and my own dignity. The conversation, which I had hoped would be a step toward healing, instead confirmed the depth of the chasm. Each misstatement she repeated, each flash of defensiveness, underscored the impossibility of immediate resolution. My heart ached not for lost arguments, but for the realization that sometimes love alone cannot bridge the narratives built by others' interference. As I left the space, the weight of the encounter pressed heavily on my shoulders. I carried with me the somber understanding that boundaries were no longer optional. They were necessary, not as punishment, but as a shield for the self-respect I had preserved through years of quiet sacrifice. I recognized that some truths could not be forced upon another, and that stepping back might be the only path to maintaining both dignity and hope for eventual, distant understanding. The room now emptied, I sat alone with the echo of her words and the knowledge that some wounds, though tender, must be acknowledged without expectation of immediate closure. I waited, heart thudding, as she finally let the walls around her emotions crack. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, and the weight of everything unsaid pressed between us. Slowly, she began to speak, voice trembling, confessions of misunderstanding, of seeing my intentions through a lens tainted by fear rather than truth. She told me how someone, her fiancé, perhaps a close friend, had painted my support as controlling, a narrative that grew in her mind until it became indistinguishable from reality. Every sacrifice, every effort I had made to quietly support her was reframed as interference, as manipulation in the stories she had been fed. I felt a mixture of sorrow and disbelief. It wasn't malice that had shaped her distance. It was fear, misinformation, and misplaced shame. My daughter had carried a burden of guilt for thinking she owed defiance where understanding should have been. The anger rose in me, sharp and righteous, but it was tempered by a deeper, quieter grief. She had suffered, believing lies, and I had watched her carry them unknowingly. As she spoke, admitting how the narratives of others had taken root, I began to see the true cost, the erosion of trust, the invisible wounds inflicted by misperception. Her shame was palpable, a heavy cloak she had worn, and it had kept her from recognizing the quiet love in my actions. The emotional distance, which had seemed deliberate, was instead the manifestation of anxiety and misplaced loyalty. The moment was raw, exposing the fragility of both our hearts. I felt the tension of mutual wounds, the ways we had hurt each other without intent, through silence, assumption, and external influence. My own sorrow weighed heavily. For every misinterpreted gesture, every silent sacrifice, every whispered hope of closeness that had gone unrecognized, it became painfully clear that some pain had been inevitable. No amount of explanation could have prevented the distortions planted by others, and no measure of parental care could fully counteract the fears that had guided her actions. I understood now, with a sorrowful clarity, the limits of influence a parent holds. Love and guidance can nurture, protect, and support, but they cannot override the choices, fears, or perceptions of an adult child shaped by external voices. We sat in silence afterward, the air thick with the acknowledgement of what had been lost, not through cruelty, but through circumstance, misunderstanding, and fear. I recognized the tragedy in that reality. A love once clear and unbroken, now obscured by unseen hands and silent misconception. Even as I felt the sting of betrayal, the weight of grief, I also recognized the human truth beneath it. Her actions were not born of hatred, and mine had always been born of care. The emotional clarity, however painful, allowed me to see both our flaws and our limitations with unflinching honesty. I left that space with heavy understanding. Some lessons are learned too late, and some wounds, though never meant, leave marks that neither time nor explanation can entirely erase. I stood alone in the quiet of the now empty ballroom, my gaze drawn to the corner where her dress hung, untouched since that day. The intricate stitches, each one placed by my own hands under the soft lamplight of late nights, told a story of patience, care, and love that had gone unseen. Every delicate fold, every careful hem was a testament to devotion, a labor I had poured quietly into her happiness. The memory of her wedding day haunted me. The empty chair where I'd expected to sit, her deliberate avoidance, the subtle public distancing that cut sharper than any words. I replayed the scene in my mind, balancing the pride of seeing her radiant with the crushing ache of rejection. The dress, suspended in stillness, was a silent witness to all the effort, all the devotion, and all the heartbreak. I considered briefly whether revealing every truth would change anything. Would it bridge the gap between us, or deepen it beyond repair? The answer eluded me. Her perception had been shaped by external voices, by the pressures and whispers of others, and my own attempts at connection had been thwarted before they could take root. Even if she knew, would she understand the sacrifices, the nights of strained eyes, the constant worry, the unwavering support given in silence? The thought of confronting her with these truths filled me with both longing and fear. Longing to be acknowledged, to have my devotion seen, and fear that it might only push her further away, that my revelation would shatter the delicate balance she had created in her own mind. I realized that some knowledge, some stories, must remain untold if they risk more harm than healing. In the stillness, I reflected on the boundaries I must maintain, not out of bitterness, but for self-respect and the preservation of dignity. There is strength in restraint, and there is sorrow in acceptance. The dress remained in its quiet corner, a symbol of all that had been given and all that had been misunderstood. It held the weight of my love and the truth of my labor. silent but immovable, a mirror to the empty chair that had marked the day of both joy and betrayal. I acknowledged, with a quiet, almost imperceptible exhale, that some bonds are tested beyond repair, and that reconciliation is not always within reach. Love can exist alongside distance. Care can persist alongside estrangement. The recognition of my limits did not diminish my devotion. It defined it. I had given everything within my power, and sometimes that is all one can do. The ballroom felt colder now, but there was clarity in the chill. Acceptance does not require reunion, and peace does not require acknowledgement. I left the dress where it hung, the chair where it had remained, and carried with me a steady, reflective strength, tempered by sadness, but intact. My love had not failed, even if it had not been returned in kind. My dignity remained unyielding, as did my understanding of what it means to give without expectation. Should he reveal everything, or let silence keep the peace she thinks she has?